Claire Evans, that's me, 26 years old, holding in my hands a master's degree in business administration from Boston University after years of struggling alone with tuition, debt, and endless part-time shifts. Tonight, my parents said they were throwing me a graduation party at their suburban home in Massachusetts. Naively, I thought this would be one of those rare occasions when my efforts would finally be acknowledged, that I would sit in the place of honor, hear words of praise, and see pride in their eyes. But when I stepped into the dining room, the first thing I noticed was not joy, but a strange arrangement. The long table was covered with a white cloth, the chandelier lights glimmered on porcelain plates and crystal glasses my mother usually only brought out for Christmas or Thanksgiving. The setting looked like a grand celebration, but the person at the center of it was not me. At the head of the table, where I should have been seated, was Melissa, my younger sister, just 23, still stumbling through life and often relying on our parents to cover her rent. My parents were beaming, pouring red wine into the elegant glasses, while I, the one who had just finished a grueling academic journey, was placed in a side seat, like a stranger in what was supposed to be my own celebration. A sinking unease spread through me. Tonight was clearly not just about congratulating my achievement, something else was waiting to be revealed. I tried to keep my face composed, lifting a glass of water to my lips while laughter and chatter filled the room. The cool sip sliding down my throat did little to ease the heat rising in my chest. My father set his wine glass on the table, his face glowing as if he were about to announce great news. He looked around slowly, then lowered his voice just enough for everyone to hear clearly. "Next week, Melissa will be moving in with you, Claire, into that spacious house of yours. Just until she gets more settled." The words fell gently, as though it were the most reasonable, natural thing in the world, but inside me they struck like thunder. I froze, my fingers still resting on the glass, sweat breaking out across my palms. My eyes darted around the table, waiting for someone to say it was a joke, that they were only teasing. But instead of surprise, I saw beaming smiles, nods of approval, and even congratulations for this new plan from familiar faces. Melissa sat at the head of the table, her blonde hair glistening under the chandelier, grinning brightly. She bowed her head to thank everyone, as though this entire evening were a celebration for her, not for me. I heard the sound of a spoon clinking against a crystal glass, and Aunt Sarah raised her glass in a toast. "How wonderful," she said. "Melissa finally has a more stable place to stay. She won't have to worry about temporary rentals anymore." Everyone lifted their glasses together, the red wine shimmering under the warm golden lights, as if this were an official celebration. I sat frozen, my hands stiff, my heart pounding in my chest. In that instant, the full truth hit me. My parents had already decided that the house I had bled and sweated to buy was nothing more than a shared family asset, a shelter for Melissa whenever she needed it. In their eyes, it had never truly been mine. They never once acknowledged the sacrifices I had made to have it. To them, I was only a placeholder, while Melissa was the one who mattered. It is hard to put into words the feeling of being sidelined in the very story of your own life, when all your efforts are reduced to nothing more than the backdrop for someone else's spotlight. Have you ever found yourself in that same position, fighting with everything you have, only to be made invisible in your own family? And if you're watching this right now, I genuinely want to know, where are you following this story from? I sat there, surrounded by laughter, a slow-burning anger rising inside me, though outwardly I forced a stiff smile and took another sip of water to hide the trembling in my hands. It felt as if I had become a mere spectator in a play directed by my own family, where my role was nothing more than a supporting character, while the lead had already been cast as Melissa. Tonight, at my so-called graduation party, I was once again pushed to the margins, watching as my parents openly turned my achievement into a pedestal for my sister. And in that very moment, I knew this was only the beginning of a confrontation I had spent my whole life avoiding but could no longer run from. Amid the clinking of glasses and the hollow chorus of false congratulations echoing through the room, I sat there, forcing myself to swallow the bitterness caught in my throat. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I should have seen this coming. The signs had been there days ago. I had just been too buried in my thesis, my job, and the fleeting joy of finally shaping my own life after graduation to notice. 3 days earlier, when I walked from the kitchen into the garage to grab some tools to fix a light, I stumbled over a few clear plastic bins stacked against the wall. On the lids were strips of white tape, with Melissa's familiar handwriting scrawled across. Melissa's clothes, winter, and Melissa's books. I remember pausing for a few seconds, wondering why my sister's belongings were here, in my garage, instead of her rented apartment in Cambridge. When I texted Melissa about it, she laughed it off and replied curtly, "Just temporary, sis. I haven't sorted out my place yet." At the time, I wanted to believe her. I told myself maybe she was just storing things for a few days. But deep down, a quiet sense of unease had already begun to stir. And then there was that phone call I overheard at my mother's house a week ago. I remember it vividly. That afternoon, I had gone back to grab some old documents from my study. As I started down the staircase, I caught my mother's voice drifting from the kitchen, low and excited, as though she were discussing something wonderful. "Claire must get so lonely rattling around in that big house all by herself, Sarah. If Melissa moved in, it would make so much sense. She'd have company, and we wouldn't have to worry so much." I froze on the stairs, my heart hammering. For a split second, I nearly stormed in and confronted her, but then I stopped, convincing myself I must have misheard, that maybe they were just idly chatting. But clearly, they weren't. And now, with everything declared so ceremoniously at the dinner table, I knew with certainty that what I'd overheard that day was not casual talk at all. It was part of a plan, quietly crafted and already set in motion. I glanced around the table and caught the cheerful eyes of the relatives, my father's approving nod, my mother's satisfied smile, and the gleeful excitement in Melissa's every gesture. A chill ran through me. They all knew, they all agreed, they had all been part of a script written in advance, and I, the rightful owner of the house, was the only one left out. The cruel irony was that I, the only person with the authority to decide, had become the very last to know. Betrayal seeped into every fiber of my body, like an invisible blade driven into my chest, forcing me to realize that in this family, the truth had never once belonged to me. I set my glass of water down, hearing the faint clink of ice against glass. My hands trembled so much it was impossible to hide, but my gaze was steady, cold, and resolute, like a sheet of ice covering the storm of anger raging within. Melissa leaned closer, her lips curving into that sweet smile I knew too well, a smile that had never once been innocent. "You'll be happy," she murmured with quiet confidence. "With me around, you won't be so lonely. It'll be just like when we were kids again." I heard every word, but they pierced me like needles pressing into an old wound. I didn't answer. I just sat there, forcing my breath to remain steady, as memories came flooding back in waves. I remembered so clearly that favoritism had not started when we grew up. It had been there since we were children. Back in elementary school, whenever the two of us made a mistake, I was always the one punished harshly, while Melissa was brushed off with a simple, "She's still young. Don't be too hard on her." I could still recall the evening I brought home a bad grade on a math test. My father's brows furrowed, and he made me sit at my desk until late into the night, redoing the entire workbook. But just a few years later, when Melissa brought home the same result, my mother stroked her hair and said softly, "She has an artistic gift. Don't force her into numbers she was never meant for." As I grew a little older, into my teenage years, I once asked my parents for an old guitar so I could learn alongside my friends. They flatly refused, saying instruments were a waste of money and that I should focus on my studies. Yet, just a year later, when Melissa insisted on having a new violin, not only did my parents agree, they bought her the most expensive one in the store, complete with private lessons at home. I had to stand outside her room, listening to the sound of her bow gliding over strings, swallowing back my tears. By high school, I longed to attend a science summer camp with my classmates, but my mother told me bluntly that the cost was too high, that the family couldn't afford it. So I stayed home, working a part-time job, washing dishes at a neighborhood diner all summer. And yet, 2 years later, Melissa was sent to a prestigious music camp in New York, with every expense tuition, lodging, travel fully covered by our parents. I could only stand at the airport, forcing a smile as I waved goodbye, all the while carrying the weight of injustice in my chest, never daring to say a word in protest. All those memories, fragments I thought had long been buried, came rushing back the moment I heard my mother's calm voice over the phone. "She's going through a hard time, dear. Family has to help each other." But why was that help always one-sided? Why was it that when I struggled through 2 jobs just to pay for tuition, they told me it was my responsibility, my way of learning to be an adult? And yet for Melissa, every failure was softened into a temporary hardship, every mistake shielded by their money and protection. I sat there, watching my sister beam with delight, and a bitter ache swelled inside me. This entire dinner, this atmosphere of celebration, was nothing less than a clear affirmation of the favoritism that had defined our lives for years. And now, with Melissa so boldly declaring she would move into my home, and my parents nodding in approval as though it were the most natural thing in the world, I finally understood. What they called family was nothing more than a scale that had always tilted to one side, the side of Melissa. I took a deep breath, steadying my voice as I set a manila envelope in the center of the table. The once lively atmosphere froze, every pair of eyes snapping toward me. Slowly, I opened the envelope and pulled out a thick stack of papers, the crisp black ink still carrying the scent of fresh print. "There's something you all should know," I began, my tone calm though inside I was burning. "The house you've all been calling my house actually doesn't belong to me anymore." From my bag, I pulled out the signed contract and laid it flat on the table, turning the pages so my parents could see the bold heading gleaming under the chandelier. Purchase and sale agreement. The dining room fell into a suffocating silence. My father's brows knitted tightly as he leaned forward, squinting at the words on the page as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. My mother's mouth dropped open, her hand frozen midair with her wine glass. And Melissa, my sister, was just lifting her glass of red wine when her hands began to shake. The stem slipped through her fingers, the glass shattered against the hardwood floor, crimson spilling across the boards like blood, the sour scent rising and overpowering the food. "Last week, I signed the papers to sell this house to a young couple in Cambridge," I said, locking my eyes on every face at the table. "Within the next 30 days, I'll be moved out. This place will have nothing to do with this family anymore." My words landed sharp and final, like the strike of a gavel. Melissa's face drained of all color, her wide eyes filled with shock. My mother turned desperately toward Aunt Sarah, her look pleading for denial, but Sarah only lowered her gaze, saying nothing. And I wasn't finished. I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out my phone, and turned the screen for them to see. On it was a Pinterest board I had stumbled upon the week before, while checking through saved links on my mother's computer. The title blared across the screen: Melissa's New Room. The board was filled with images of beds, curtains, vanity tables, all neatly categorized, each one captioned with precise labels. Melissa's room, Claire's house. I slid the phone slowly past each face at the table, leaving them no room for denial. 7 years, I said, my voice tight but steady with a cold composure. 7 years of saving every cent from part-time jobs, giving up vacations, new clothes, every party with friends, just to buy this house. 7 years of sweat, of exhaustion, of sacrifice, and to all of you, it's nothing more than a temporary place for Melissa. Just another room to decorate. I gave a bitter laugh, sharp and hollow, the kind that cuts into your own chest like salt ground into an open wound. No one spoke. The ticking of the wall clock echoed through the silence like a judgment against their false quiet. In that moment, it was painfully clear they had all taken my effort as something natural, something to be divided and used. And the fact that I dared to disrupt their plan was the one shock they had never anticipated. My father was the first to shatter the heavy stillness. He shot up from his chair, the wood screeching harshly against the floor as it scraped back. His face flushed red, veins rising along his neck as he jabbed a finger at the stack of papers I'd laid on the table. You can cancel that contract right now, he thundered, his voice commanding. In Massachusetts, there's still a cooling-off period. It's not too late. Just call the lawyer, call the broker, and it's done. You're not allowed to make this decision on your own. I stared at him, the realization sinking in that every word wasn't about protecting me, it was about protecting the promise he'd already made to Melissa. My mother rose slowly after him, her face not twisted in anger like his, but softened into pleading. She placed a trembling hand on my shoulder, her voice gentler, but carrying that same familiar undertone of control. Claire, listen to me. We already promised Melissa, you can't let her down. It'll only be for a few months, just until she's stable again. Everything will work out after that. You can't be so selfish, sweetheart. I let out a dry, cutting laugh, the sound making the entire table stiffen. Selfish? I had lived all these years without asking anyone for a thing, while they had bailed Melissa out time and time again, paying her rent and covering her mistakes. They all turned a blind eye to that. And now, when all I wanted was to protect what I had earned with my own hands, suddenly I was the selfish one. I hadn't even opened my mouth when Aunt Sarah, silent since the beginning of dinner, suddenly spoke. Her tone was casual, almost slippery, as though she were reciting a plan long agreed upon. Actually, last week we already moved some of Melissa's things into your house while you were at work. We just wanted to make everything easier, so you wouldn't have to worry about it. Ah. The air around me tilted, my heart pounding so hard it felt ready to burst from my chest. So it was all arranged. Not just my parents, my aunt too. They had discussed it, prepared it, carefully plotted every detail so that Melissa could slip into my home as if it were only natural. And me? I was the legal owner on paper, yet treated like an outsider in my own life. In that moment, the truth cut through me like a cold blade. This wasn't simply a family helping a struggling daughter. This was a quiet scheme, a deliberate imposition, a betrayal wrapped in sweet words. And I knew if I didn't stand up and fight now, if I let them make the decision for me, then for the rest of my life I would remain nothing but a shadow behind Melissa, while the house I bled for would become just another piece of family property that everyone could claim a right to, everyone but me. Melissa suddenly burst into sobs, her cries filling the dining room like a tune I had heard 1,000 times before. She buried her face in her hands, tears streaking down her cheeks, her voice breaking yet loud enough for all to hear. You sold the house just to spite me. You're cruel, Claire. I only wanted a place to stay, to feel safe for once, and you've taken away my last chance. I stared at her, her shoulders shaking with each dramatic sob, and I recognized the act instantly, the same old performance Melissa had always used to win everyone's protection. My father immediately cut in, his furious eyes drilling into me. You really are selfish, Claire. All these years, this family raised you, educated you, made you who you are, and now you turn your back on your own sister? Don't you see how ungrateful you've become? His hand slammed down on the table, the glasses rattling and clinking in protest. My mother shook her head with a heavy sigh, her voice dropping lower, but no less cutting. Claire, I'm genuinely worried about you. You're not thinking straight anymore. These reckless decisions. It's like you're having some kind of psychological issue. You need to rest, reflect on yourself. No one in this family can understand the way you're behaving. I sat there, each accusation stabbing into me like a knife. A part of me wanted to scream, to throw the truth into their faces that the house had stopped being a point of pride long ago and had instead become a bottomless pit draining me dry. I had swallowed hard while paying over $12,000 to repair the roof after the March storm, emptied my emergency fund when the pipes burst, another $8,000 I never saw again, and then, in the summer, the heating system failed, dropping a $5,000 bill on me that nearly broke me completely. I had lived through months of ramen dinners and extra weekend shifts just to keep that house standing. And now, when I finally chose to let it go, they dared to call me ungrateful, selfish. 1,000 rebuttals surged through my head, but in the end I held them back. I knew this family too well. Any explanation I gave would only be twisted into proof of my supposed cruelty. They would never accept the truth, only cling to the narrative they had written. Melissa as the victim and me as the villain. I swallowed the lump in my throat, drew in a deep breath, then lifted my head, my voice so calm it startled even me. I sold the house for my own reasons. And this decision is final. The room sank into a silence so heavy I could hear the second hand of the wall clock ticking, each beat sharp against the stillness. Melissa kept sniffling into the tissue my mother had given her, her sobs echoing as if to wring out the last drops of pity from everyone present. My father sat rigid, his jaw clenched, teeth grinding, his bloodshot eyes locked on me. But this time, that glare no longer made me tremble the way it once had. I sat up straight, meeting each of their eyes in turn, letting them see that I was no longer the same. The old Claire who bowed her head and accepted everything was gone. The dinner ended without toasts, without anyone forcing out empty words about families sticking together. They cleared the table in silence, the only sound the faint clatter of cutlery against porcelain. No one looked me in the eye as they rose from their seats. Even Melissa, at the end, only muttered a weak, "I'm tired," before dragging herself upstairs, her body slumped with defeat. My parents walked away, their shoulders heavy, as if they had just lost a battle they had once been certain they would win. I stood last, pulling my coat from the back of my chair. The table before me was littered with plates of cold, untouched food, and the spilled wine had soaked into the tablecloth, leaving behind a dark red stain that looked almost like blood. Quietly, I stepped toward the door, my shoes clicking steadily against the wooden floor. No one came to see me off, no farewell, no word at all. And I didn't need one. As the door closed behind me, a cool breeze rushed in from outside, and I drew in a deep breath. My chest felt lighter, as though I had finally set down the heavy stone that had pressed on me for far too long. Just a few hours after that dinner, I saw a new post from Melissa on Facebook, along with a picture of her crying, eyes swollen red. Betrayed by my own sister, about to be homeless. Who would have thought family could treat you this way? That short caption was enough to ignite a firestorm. Sad and angry reaction emojis flooded beneath the post, followed by dozens of sympathetic comments. Poor girl, how could her own sister do that? And, what's the point of family if they act like this? I sat staring at the screen, each word pressing down on my chest like a weight. No one asked me for the truth, everyone automatically assumed I was the betrayer. By the next morning, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. Numbers from aunts, uncles, relatives who never bothered to call suddenly filled my screen. Each time I answered, there were no greetings, only scolding voices laced with contempt. "What you did was too cruel, Claire." Aunt Mary snapped into the phone. "Your sister needs help, and you'd throw her out on the street?" Before I could say a word, she hung up. Minutes later, Uncle Robert called, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "They say you're smart and successful, but really you're just selfish, heartless toward your own blood." I quietly turned off the phone, too drained to argue anymore. But the humiliation didn't stop there. At work, while I was making coffee in the break room, my colleague Lisa approached, her eyes cautious. "Claire, I heard from Melissa about your family. I'm so sorry. Are you okay?" I froze, nearly dropping the mug in my hand. So Melissa hadn't just cried on social media, she'd spread the story everywhere, painting me as the villain even in my workplace. I forced a strained smile, muttered a few polite replies, but inside I was boiling. In the evenings that followed, as I packed my belongings, I quietly gathered every important document. The $12,000 roof repair invoice, the $8,200 plumbing receipt, the $5,000 bill for replacing the heating system. I saved them all, stacking them neatly into a file. I kept the photos of the storm-torn roof, the text thread with the plumber, the drained bank statements. I knew I had to prepare because sooner or later, the truth would need to be brought into the light. As I sat alone among the piles of cardboard boxes, surrounded by the evidence of years that had drained me dry, Melissa was on the other side, being cradled by my parents, pitied by relatives, celebrated by friends as the poor, wounded victim. The contrast was so sharp it burned, leaving me both furious and bitter. My whole life, I had struggled just to make my family proud, and the result was this. I had been cast as the traitor to my own blood, while the one who had never once taken responsibility for her life was treated like a treasure to be protected at all costs. And I knew then, the only way to break free of that cycle was to face it head-on once and for all. One weekend morning, as I was getting ready for work, I received a notification about a family meeting, something my parents had hinted at several times before. They wrote that everyone should sit down together to settle this once and for all. On the surface, it sounded like an attempt at reconciliation, but I knew better. It was nothing more than another excuse to corner me, to force me back into the familiar role, the daughter who carried the weight, who endured, who sacrificed, no matter how shattered she felt inside. That afternoon at the office dragged on endlessly, my mind drifting in and out, my work mechanical and unfocused. Near closing time, my phone buzzed violently on my desk. It was my father. For a moment, I hesitated, my chest tightening, then let the ringing fade into silence. A few seconds later, the screen lit up again with a new message. 7 o'clock tonight, the whole family will be at your house. Don't refuse, this is your responsibility. I read that line again and again, its coldness cutting deeper each time. It felt less like a message from my own father than a court summons. My hand clenched the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. I didn't reply. I shoved it into my bag, walked out to the parking lot, and felt the gnawing weight in my chest grow heavier, as though I were marching straight toward a confrontation already scripted, already waiting for me. At exactly 7 o'clock, my doorbell rang. The chime was long and insistent, as if to remind me there was no escape. I drew in a deep breath and opened the door. Standing on the porch were not only my parents and Melissa, but also Aunt Sarah, Uncle Robert, and even Uncle William, the one I had feared since childhood for his stern, unyielding eyes. They filed in, heading straight for the dining room, filling every seat around the long wooden table. In that moment, my familiar home transformed into a courtroom, and I sat at the far end like the accused, bracing myself for the verdict I knew was coming. But I didn't let them speak first. I set a thick folder down in the center of the table and opened it, one page at a time. Before anyone says another word, I began, my voice startlingly calm. I want the family to see the truth no one ever bothered to ask about. I laid out the first bill, the yellow paper still bearing fresh ink. Roof repair, March $12,000. The storm punched through 3 sections, insurance didn't cover it. I paid every cent. I slid the paper forward so the number was impossible to ignore. Before anyone could react, I pulled out the second document. April, the main water line burst, flooding the basement. $8,200 total for emergency service, excavation, system replacement, and landscaping. I drained my entire emergency fund and borrowed just to cover it. A low murmur rippled around the table. I didn't pause. I held up the third paper. June, the heating system failed, and winter in Massachusetts doesn't forgive, $5,000. By then, I was nearly bankrupt. Finally, I spread out my bank statement, the balance barely a few $100s. I lifted my head, locking eyes with my parents, then sweeping my gaze across every relative. This is the real cost of keeping that house you all assumed Melissa could just move into. And this is why I had to sell it. Not out of spite, not out of selfishness, but simply to survive. A heavy silence settled over the room. This time, no one rushed to scold me. Aunt Sarah sat frozen for a few seconds, then spoke suddenly, her voice low but firm. The truth is, I've seen it for a long time. Claire has never asked anyone for help, she's handled everything on her own. Meanwhile, Melissa, there's always someone cleaning up after her. It isn't fair. I blinked in surprise, not expecting Aunt Sarah, the same one who had helped move Melissa's boxes, would speak in my defense now. Then Dorothy, my mother's longtime friend who had been quiet until now, leaned forward slightly toward me. I know how hard Claire has worked all these years. I also know Melissa's rent, her car, her credit card bills, someone else always covered them. Families want to help their children, yes, but favoritism like this, it isn't right. You need to see that. Her words sliced through the protective wall that had always shielded Melissa. Barbara, my financial advisor, whom I had invited to this meeting, spoke next. She opened her own folder, her tone steady, like she was delivering a lecture. I've reviewed Claire's finances. If she continued keeping that house, she would be at risk of bankruptcy within a year. Selling was the only responsible choice. And another thing, your constant handouts to Melissa aren't helping her grow. They're deepening her dependency. I watched as my parents' faces drained of color. My father clenched his fists tightly, no longer slamming the table as he had before. My mother stayed quiet, her lips pressed into a thin line. And then, the most unexpected of all, Uncle William, the man I had feared most, turned to Melissa, his eyes sharp and unyielding. So tell me, Melissa, he said, what exactly is your current job? All I've heard is you're figuring things out. At this point, what do you actually have to show? Melissa froze, her face pale as paper, her lips moving but no sound escaping. The entire room waited. No answer came. The atmosphere inside the house had shifted completely. For the first time, I was no longer the one cornered, no longer the one branded as cruel. The eyes that had always judged me with silent condemnation now flickered with unease, doubt cast instead upon Melissa, the daughter who had been coddled beyond reason. My parents said nothing more. They didn't defend her, and they didn't accuse me again. They just sat there, quiet, as though finally forced to confront a truth they had spent years hiding. And I knew then the battle was finally turning. A week after that tense family conference, I heard the familiar knock at my door once more. When I opened it, my parents stood there, faces taut with forced calm, Melissa lingering behind them with eyes still red but filled with a faint, desperate hope. They entered my home as if arriving with some kind of peace offering, sitting down on the sofa in a living room cluttered with boxes from my ongoing move. My father spoke first, his voice softer than usual, measured as though rehearsed for negotiation. Claire, your mother and I have discussed it. We can find a compromise. You don't have to let Melissa live with you if it makes you uncomfortable. But you could help her with a monthly allowance for rent. Just a few $100s after selling the house, that's nothing for you. My mother nodded quickly, her voice thick with pleading. You know Melissa isn't stable in her career yet. She needs time. If you could just support her a little, everything would be easier. We don't need more fighting in this family. Her words hung in the silence of the room, sweet but heavy like bait in a trap. I looked directly at my parents, then turned to Melissa. She stayed quiet, her hands twisting nervously in her lap, like a child waiting to be forgiven. I drew a long breath, then slowly shook my head. I won't give her an allowance. I won't pay a single dollar. But, I paused, reaching into my bag and pulling out a polished business card. I can give her an opportunity. I placed the card squarely in front of Melissa. This is the contact for my company's HR department. Next week, the marketing team is opening an entry-level position. The salary will be enough for you to afford a one-bedroom apartment in Cambridge. I'll speak to HR first so they can schedule an interview for you. But the decision to show up, to work, to actually try, that's yours. The room fell into silence. Melissa stared at the business card, her lips pressed tightly together, clearly unprepared for such an offer. My father furrowed his brow, about to speak, but I quickly opened the second folder I had prepared in advance. Inside were pages filled with numbers and charts, all neatly organized. I slid them across the table toward my parents, my eyes unwavering. This is a record of every expense you've covered for Melissa over the past 5 years. 3 separate rent payments, each nearly $2,000, car installments totaling almost $12,000. At least 4 credit card bailouts, adding up to more than $10,000. Not to mention countless smaller expenses. Even with rough calculations, it's already over $35,000, and I'm certain the actual figure is far higher. My parents froze, their eyes fixed on the cold numbers staring back at them. My mother opened her mouth to protest, but no words came. My father snorted, making a last attempt. We only wanted to help her, she's had difficulties. I cut him off, my voice calm but sharp as a blade. This isn't help, this is indulgence. And it's destroying everything, Melissa and this family. You think you're protecting her, but what you're really doing is keeping her from ever growing up." Melissa sat motionless, her hands trembling, her eyes lost. I saw her glance at the business card again, then quickly look away, tears pooling in her eyes. My parents had no argument left. They remained a few minutes longer in heavy silence before finally rising to leave. No formal goodbyes, no more accusations, just the silence of people who had been forced to confront the truth at last. As they stepped out the door, I caught sight of Melissa slowly reaching for the card, slipping it into her palm as if she didn't want anyone to notice. The door closed behind them, leaving me alone in the cluttered room. But this time, I didn't feel isolated or powerless. I knew the boundary had been drawn, and I would never allow anyone to erase it again. 3 weeks later, I officially moved out of the suburban Massachusetts house, the place that had once been the dream I spent 7 years building, but had also become the burden that dragged me to the bottom. That afternoon, as I handed the keys to the young couple in Cambridge, I stood on the porch watching them embrace, their faces glowing with joy. A bittersweet ache stirred in me, but above all was relief. Driving back into downtown Boston, I arrived at my new apartment, smaller, brighter, more manageable. The living room window opened onto bustling streets, where the city lights shimmered at night. My monthly payments were nearly 40% lower than at the old house, and for the first time in years, I could breathe without the fear of bills suffocating me. That very evening, I opened my laptop and signed up for a beginner's photography class at a nearby art center, something I had always dreamed of but never dared to pursue. I bought the camera I had often admired in the shop window, spending money not on crisis or obligation, but on joy. A few months later, when autumn painted Boston streets in gold, my parents invited Melissa and me home for dinner. I stepped into the familiar kitchen with hesitation, bracing myself for the usual tension. But to my surprise, the evening felt different. My father asked about my job, about life in the new apartment. My mother listened intently as I spoke about my photography class, her eyes softer, no longer filled with judgment. Across from me, Melissa sat without the arrogance she once carried, her face glowing with pride as she spoke about her new job in the marketing department, the very opportunity I had opened the door to. She talked about early mornings catching the bus to the office, about the first time she paid her own rent with her own paycheck. I looked at her, and to my own surprise, I felt a flicker of relief. For perhaps the first time in years, she was finally learning to stand on her own feet. In that moment, I realized something important. Setting boundaries, saying no, and protecting myself had not destroyed this family the way they once accused me of doing. On the contrary, it had saved all of us from a toxic cycle of dependence. If I had continued to stay silent and endure, Melissa would never have grown up, and my parents would have remained trapped in the illusion that indulgence was the same as love. Sometimes, refusal is the only way to force change. As I sat in my new apartment in downtown Boston, the sunset casting long streaks of light across the glass windows, I thought about the road I had traveled. From a young woman crushed beneath endless bills, I had found my way back to steady, peaceful breaths. And the message I want to leave for anyone listening to this story is this: real love is never the same as unconditional indulgence. Real love is teaching one another how to stand tall, to take responsibility, and to honor each other's boundaries. Cutting off what is toxic is not selfish, it is an act of saving yourself, and sometimes, the only way to save the people you love as well. If there is one thing I want to leave with everyone listening to this story, it is this: setting boundaries is not selfish, it is an act of loving yourself. For far too long, I lived under the belief that only by carrying the weight, by enduring, by sacrificing, could I be considered a good daughter. But the truth is, when you allow others to keep crossing your boundaries, you slowly lose yourself. I want to tell you that you have every right to say no. You have the right to protect what you have worked so hard to build, the right to live for your own happiness and peace. And sometimes, it is the strength to refuse, to step away from toxic cycles, that becomes the only way to force those around you to change. So if you find yourself being dismissed, taken advantage of, or feeling like nothing more than a shadow in your own family or relationship, remember you are not alone. Choosing to stand up, choosing to protect yourself, not only saves you, but may also give others the chance to finally learn how to grow. True love is never blind sacrifice, it is knowing your own worth and teaching others to do the same. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to sharing more stories with you next time.